here today. So, as Maria said, my name is Danita Burke, and I am presently based at SDU, the University of Southern Denmark, where I am a Marie Curie Fellow, which is funded by a ERC grant. The research that I'm here to talk to you about today is work that I have published through Palgrave Macmillan, and it's a book that I spent 6 years writing. And so I'm very happy to have the opportunity to come here to the University of Greenland today and to tell you all about my research. And after I do my presentation, very happy to hear any questions, and so that way we can have a bit more of an open discussion about this work and about your own reflection, speaking from a more of a Greenlandic perspective. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'll be covering here now this evening. First, I'll just give you a bit of background, then I'll go into what I call the predominant ideas, key ideas that have come through in the research I've done about the Canadian Arctic. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about disputes and sovereignty. Then I'll go into a discussion about a particular case study over the Northwest Passage. Though I won't speak about this in isolation, the PowerPoint will show just the information about the Northwest Passage, but I will be speaking about it in comparison to the dispute that has been happening historically between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark over little areas up in the Lincoln Sea, just so you can compare and contrast about my discussion about how ideas about the Arctic can influence the resolution of certain disputes versus others. And then a little bit of conclusion, and then naturally, because I have had many a benefactor over the past few years to help me get to where I am today, be plenty of acknowledgements to go around. So, a bit of the background. So up here, I'll just let you read those on your own. These are the central research questions which have underpinned the research. So what my book is about the evolution of ideas in the Canadian Arctic and its subsequent influence on how Canada has approached disputes in the Arctic region. So it's a combination of a political history. It has a lot of focus on Canada in isolation, but also then using that knowledge and depth of information about Canada's relationship with the Arctic to help broaden understandings about why Canada behaves the way that it does when it comes to relations with other Arctic states and in the Arctic region more generally. So essentially making the argument that social and political factors play a large role in how disputes are approached and how disputes are potentially resolved, in order to push against a belief that sometimes comes through in the literature that these things can be solved purely on their legal basis. Well, no doubt legal elements are certainly prevalent and very important in the resolution of any dispute. The belief that these different disputes, particularly with regards to Canada and the Arctic region, are devoid of political history and a mode of reaction kind of negates any understanding about the types of factors that the different negotiators have to navigate when they're discussing about potential resolutions that the Government of Canada can take home and sell to its domestic audience. So the predominant ideas. In my book, I dedicate 3 chapters, 1 chapter to each of these ideas. The romantic ideas, the economic ideas, and the security ideas. And these are the key themes about ideas about the Arctic that exist in Canada. By no means would this necessarily be a full inclusive list. I'm sure there's sub-ideas, particularly as they pertain to different subcultures within Canadian society. But generally speaking, on a macro level, over the 200 plus years of Canada, first as a British colony, then as its own country, these are the ideas that really come through. These ideas are important to understand for a couple of reasons, and it'll become a little bit more evident when I go into the next slide. One is the notion that there is no homogeneous way in which the Arctic is thought about within Canada. That is important to understand, because when this is happening internally within Canada, these different ideas play a different role at different points in time and sometimes conflict with each other. But when outside forces come into play in a dispute type situation, there is a projection of homogeneity that make it seem as though there is one Canadian position and one Canadian way of seeing the Arctic region. But that happens when an outsider proposes a view that runs counter to any Canadian views. This pertains more about how the different views have evolved within Canada internally. Now, we'll start off with the romantic ones. Now, no doubt, as with people here in Greenland, you deal with this issue of people having romanticized notions about what the Arctic is and what it looks like. In the Canadian context, Canada was a former British colony, and its early conceptions about the Arctic region were heavily influenced by British history and the way that the Arctic was portrayed within British media, books, diaries by former Royal Navy officers and by merchants, paintings. The Victorian era in particular has been quite poignant in the early conceptualizations of the Arctic as this barren, frozen other world. Now, this isn't to say that that is necessarily completely wrong, but it's certainly selective. Because one thing that's quite evident as being missing in there are the people who actually live in the Arctic region, who are often either marginalized or downplayed in their importance in early representations about the Arctic region. In this early idea about the Arctic, now the romantic ideas are perhaps the strongest and most recognizable within Canadian politics. And what you will find is that most people have some story or some idea about what the Arctic is like. And there are many different influences over the years in Canadian history which have contributed to this belief not only of what the Arctic is and looks like, but also the size of the Canadian Arctic. So a couple of examples that I will give you here, which really lend to the evolution and the insistence on these romantic ideas, is the way that it's been portrayed on government official maps and the way that it has been perpetuated within Canadian society through media representations and through simple engagements with children. So, for example, in terms of maps, inconsistently, the maps of the Government of Canada have shown lines that represent the Canadian Arctic as extending up to the North Pole. These are based upon a principle called sector theory. This is a legally defunct way of drawing boundaries. Essentially, the way that it worked is that a boundary line was drawn from the furthermost points of Canada's mainland with some, for lack of better technical terms, squiggly bits that go up because of the equidistance principle that was applied between the Canadian and Danish / Greenlandic Arctic in the 1970s. But with the exception of that boundary, it extends straight up to the North Pole. And these lines don't come up on every government map, but they have come up on government maps for well over 100 years. And what these lines give the impression of is that everything within them belongs to Canada. And people can be understood for coming to that impression because they are official maps from the government. You would think the government would know what its own boundaries are and would draw accordingly. The problem is, Canada never legally made any sort of claim that these lines represented Canada's official boundaries in the Arctic region. They still haven't. In fact, I think it was in 2006 that former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper officially denounced sector theory as representing Canada's boundaries in the Arctic region, but then in the subsequent year, in one of the government's official Arctic documents, a map showing those exact lines was in the document again. So there's an inconsistency in the way that the dialogue is portrayed about it, but the government maps have constantly given people the impression that Canada's jurisdiction goes all the way up to the North Pole. And as you all, being here in Greenland, who also claims jurisdiction up to the North Pole, can attest, not everybody agrees with Canada on that claim. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The point about the way that the Arctic is portrayed, this romanticized pristineness in Canadian society. Two good examples that I discuss a bit in the book. One is about the way that the Arctic is portrayed as this otherworldly space with this emphasis on ice and pristineness and emptiness, and the work of the Group of Seven, particularly the work of the artist Lorne Harris. Now, the Group of Seven is some of the most famous artists to come out of Canada, early 20th century. And these images that came out from the Group of Seven's work and their representations of the North and the Arctic have been quite influential on perpetuating beliefs about the way that the Arctic is represented within Canadian society and international exposure to how Canada has portrayed what its Arctic is and what it looks like. More contemporary representations, for example, everybody knows about the United States and Hollywood. Okay. But Canadian English language, not media, but television shows and film don't have quite the same sort of impact, whether it be in Canada or internationally. French language is a bit different. They're funded differently. But a few shows and movies have had a profound impact and have had a lot of appeal. And one of those shows is the show called Due South, which came out in the 1990s. You're shaking your head because you don't know what I'm talking about. But you Google it, and I swear you would have come across an image of the lead character in his full formal dress of the RCMP in the red. Now, in this television show, there was 3 seasons. Now, I'm not making any claim that whoever the writers were of the television show sat down and decided we're going to represent the Canadian Arctic in a rather particular way. But what they did do is that they showed ideas about the Arctic which they knew would resonate in the audience that they were pitching their show to. And the way that the show is written is that there is a lead character who's, a stereotypical Canadian in the sense that he's grown up in the Arctic. He's a rather isolated, very polite man who spends his whole time going around in the official red dress of the RCMP, so he essentially looks a bit like a 18th century British soldier. Nothing ever happens to his uniform. It's a continuous gag. He's, jumped into garbage cans, off cliffs, and his uniform always looks perfect. It was actually a legal requirement because they weren't allowed to damage the uniform. But it was a continuous gag that he always looked perfect, next to his partner, who was an American detective who, the poor man couldn't get out of his own way. He always looked like he was a mess because he got to dress in plain clothing. But there was a contrast between this idea of this man who grew up in the Northwest Territories, whose pet was half wolf, whose father was an RCMP officer who got killed up in the Arctic, who he speaks to the ghost of his dead dad, and it all resonates with these old ideas about the Arctic, which comes from the British stories about the search for Franklin and British exploration into the Arctic region, and it really resonates and plays off that. But what it also plays off is the idea that there's often this misconception and misrepresentation of Canadian identity as being anti-American. I make the opposite argument. It's not that Canadians are anti-American. I don't agree with that statement. It's that they're pro-Canadian. How often, as a Canadian who travels abroad, that when you open your mouth and you start to speak, if you're not a French Canadian with a clear French accent, that someone looks at you and says, "Are you American?" That can grate on you after a while, because the problem is it's not that I'm anti-American, but why can't you just ask me where I'm from? Because I think that in Canada, there's always been this struggle about demonstrating certain key characteristics that define who Canadians are, what is Canada. And Canada has struggled with this, trying to find key identifiable characteristics. And these romanticized notions about the Arctic have helped to play into this. And as the shows such as Due South helps to represent, that there's no anti-American sentiments there. It simply shows the resilience of one man who goes to the United States in the search for his father, and he can work perfectly fine with Americans who are also stereotypically represented in the show. But ultimately, it's about the fact that two countries with different peoples who can coexist without one necessarily being anti the other. But the types of imageries that are drawn upon in order to illustrate Canadianness are often associated with northernness and romanticized portrayals of what northernness is. And lastly, a rather cute example, and Canada's by no means the only country to have this, is letters to Santa Claus. In Canada, any child will know that the postal address for Santa Claus is HOH. Oh, hey, Joe, you're shaking your head, my fellow Canadian. So HOH, OHO, Canada. Now, Santa Claus has got many residences, people in Lapland and Greenland and the United States and Iceland and elsewhere would tell you. But in Canada, this program through Canada Post, which I am not saying that Canada Post is in some sort of conspiracy to indoctrinate Canadians into the certain Arctic ideas. But there's this perpetuation of the idea that Santa Claus is Canadian, and it can seem rather benign. But what it does do is that it encourages children from a very young age to believe that Canada owns the North Pole, which feeds back into these ideas that the sector theory lines, which are used to give the impression about the size of Canada, of course they're true. I always grew up thinking that Santa Claus was Canadian. I wrote letters to him for years. And it might seem rather simple, and in many respects it is. But these little things teach people about what it is that their country's relationship and their relationship with the region is. And over time, these little experiences build up and leave an impression about who you are as a citizen of a country and what your country is and what is being represented by it. Then you have the economic ideas. Now, the economic ideas in Canada about the Arctic have been heavily influenced by the Yukon Gold Rush. Now, the Yukon Gold Rush really sprung about in the late 1890s, and it is still represented continuously through board games, and also video games. So just as an example, in the United States, very early on in the development of PCs and computer games, there was a game called the Oregon Trail. This was hugely popular. And so they developed a parallel game in Canada, the Yukon Trail. Now, I can't really tell you just how popular the Yukon Trail was, but the fact that when they're sitting down thinking, what is the Canadian equivalent to the big American Oregon Trail, the Yukon Trail is something that comes up into mind, and is not just represented there, it's represented in numerous board games, which is discussed in the book, which again lead into this idea about the Arctic as a region that can be economically gained from. But it's more than that. It's not just that the Arctic region is a place where economic gains can be had. It's that the economic gains can be huge, but for very few. That it's a hard region to get into, and only the bravest and the toughest can manage it. And this plays into some of the discourse that you see in the media about the development of the Arctic region, about certain companies pulling out of certain licenses at different points in time, as though they couldn't hack it up in this harsh region. Now, again, in some ways this can be an oversimplification. But over time and years, and these ideas really have been perpetuated over years, there has been a slow percolation of belief about there's a certain economic angle to which the Arctic is discussed. And as an area where only the toughest and the bravest can get into, but if you make it, my God, you'll be rich. That kind of notion does exist. Now, some of this, again, also starts back from the British exploration of the Arctic. The earliest interest in the Arctic region by Europeans stemmed from going into the Arctic temporarily to make big money off of things like the blubber trade and off the fur trade. It was never really seeing the Arctic as an area to inhabit. It was seen as an area to go in, profit from, and export all of the money for more southern-based audiences and more southern-based opportunities. And you see that kind of discourse and way of thinking continue to play out in Canada as well. There has been pushback against it, particularly with the rising rights and establishment of devolution of territorial powers and the establishment of land claims and the increasing role of Indigenous peoples in the way that the Arctic region is being governed. But these age-old beliefs that the Arctic region is an area where there's big money to be had, but for a select few, and it's not an area necessarily to be set up with the next big city. It's an area for profits to be had and exported. They still exist. And a good example about how these notions have come into play and have been pushed back against comes about in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, there was the discovery of natural gas up in the Delta, the Mackenzie Delta. You have to take another step back further and contextualize that. So when this happened, there was the big discovery of oil over in Alaska in the 1960s. And when this big oil discovery was found, the idea of Arctic exploration and big economic projects really kicked up a notch. And the equivalent in Canada was this Mackenzie Delta pipeline idea. The government at the time commissioned Thomas Berger to inquire about whether or not this was actually a good idea for Canada to make this sort of development. Happening parallel to his inquiry was the slow development of land claims negotiations with First Nations peoples, as well as Indigenous peoples, mainly Inuit, up in the Arctic region. Various land claims. The process started in 1973. So you have the proposal for a large economic development, which would have shipped oil through pipelines down through the territories into the provinces. And this is happening at the same time that legal rights was being sorted out and land claim negotiations were being sorted out with Indigenous peoples. It wasn't completed at that time, so there was no guarantee about their role and their ability to profit from or have insight into what was happening. Berger came out and he recommended that the government not proceed, and they ultimately didn't. But one of the reasons why he made this recommendation was that he highlighted the fact that these European notions about how development should occur and the persistent belief that economic development needed to happen in a rather particular manner, which was heavily influenced by these economic ideas, was resulting in pressure for the government to make a development before it finished its obligations, which it has started with Indigenous peoples to make agreements to guarantee their rights in their own homeland. So he recommended that any proceeding with the Mackenzie Delta project be held off until land claim negotiations were sorted out. Now, since that time, the development never happened. But that was a rather important moment within Canadian politics and challenging of the existence of these ideas about the Arctic. Because what they essentially reminded people was that there's more than one way of thinking about the Arctic region, and that there's a lot of subliminal messaging and cultural assumptions about how Arctic development should occur and who should have a say and profit how. And so since that time, there's been a slow change that has been happening in the legal and political side with regards to Arctic development and Arctic politics. But the societal ideas about the Arctic have been slower to evolve. Now lastly, the other big idea set that exists about the Arctic region, and this is a two-pointer, is security ideas as in military security and environmental security. Now, the military security ideas are highly influenced by the Cold War era. This idea that the Russians are coming over the North Pole, the dew lines, all of that, have played a large role in ideas about what the Arctic is and how it needs to be protected and what is needed. The environmental ideas, they have been much more prominent as of late. Now, this has been influenced by the fact that Canada is a member of the Arctic Council, and as a member of the Arctic Council, a key point of the discussion there is environmental protection and economic development. So the idea of environmental protection, for example, through search and rescue agreements, really plays into these ideas. But essentially, what both the military and the environmental ideas have in common is this idea of protection. Whether you're protecting from a foreign power or protecting from environmental damage, there's protection. Within these ideas, there's also been this notion of stewardship. Stewardship has been a very important idea within Canada's environmental conceptions about its role in the Arctic region and how it will approach that role. And this really came about in the next case, which I'll discuss with you here when I discuss the Northwest Passage. So in Canada, there are essentially a number of different international disputes that exist in the Arctic region. And in my book, I dedicate 2 chapters in which I discuss these at length. One chapter discusses the Northwest Passage dispute in quite a bit of length, whereas the second chapter discusses the Lincoln Sea dispute and the Beaufort boundary dispute. Within the discussion of the Lincoln Sea dispute, there's also discussion about Hans Island. Now, the reason why the Northwest Passage takes up a full chapter, whereas the other ones get about a half a chapter each, is because of the history that has gone into the evolution of that dispute has had a lot of subsequent influence on the other 2. And they're not identical in the terms of what is actually being disputed. So the Northwest Passage receives a disproportionate amount of the media attention about Canada's relations with the Arctic region and any disputes there. Despite the way that it's spoken about sometimes, it is not a ownership dispute. What it is a legal status dispute. And what that means is that there is a lot of dispute about the extent to which Canada can interfere in shipping in the Northwest Passage. But before I even get into that, you got to figure out what is the Northwest Passage. And the simple answer is the Northwest Passage doesn't exist. It's a figment of our imagination. What is actually being discussed is a series of different waterways through the Canadian Arctic archipelago that could be used for shipping. And they are often referred to as the Northwest Passage as one entity, but it's a number of different routes. Canada claims that these are its internal waters. Now, what that essentially means is that Canada can control anything that happens there. It has about the same legal rights as a river or a lake. Pretty much everybody else argues that Canada's wrong and that this is an international strait. Now, what that means is that Canada can't stop a vessel from transiting through from one point to the other with certain conditions. For example, that the vessel isn't, if it's a military vessel, for example, that it doesn't have any intentions of attacking Canada while it's going through. If they wanted to attack Canada, maybe try somewhere a little less problematic to get into, but essentially that's the idea. And then the terms of all of that is laid out in the law of the sea agreement: internal waters, territorial seas, and international strait. Problem is that it's not entirely clear when an area moves from being internal waters to an international strait. Who gets to determine what the appropriate volume of traffic makes a waterway suddenly warranting the label of an international strait? Canada disagrees and so it instead argues that it's its own waters. With the Beaufort Sea and the Lincoln Sea, you're dealing with a whole different situation. This isn't a legal status thing, this is straight up ownership. And these are bilateral disputes. So with Beaufort Seas between Canada and the United States up by Alaska, and essentially the disagreement there was it's something both sides have inherited as a result of Russia when it used to own Alaska and Britain when it used to control Canada. They came up with a treaty which decided what the boundary would be between Alaska and the Yukon. What can't be agreed on is, does this treaty line extend out into the ocean? And as a result, there's a huge wedge-shaped area which both sides disagree on who owns what. In the Lincoln Sea, it's much more simplistic. It's two little tiny areas which are not even discernible on a large map, and it is the implication of the way that the boundaries were drawn in the 1970s between Canada and Greenland. And up in the very top, up in the Lincoln Sea area, up the top of Ellesmere Island and Greenland, the sides disagree on, so they agree that the boundary should be decided by equidistance principle. So, meet in the middle. But they can't agree on the point of departure to draw that. And as a result, these two little areas have gotten stuck in the middle. Given that it's the worst ice conditions in the North American Arctic, and nobody goes up there, it hasn't exactly been a hot topic. But that's important, as we will discuss now in a second. But happening with the Lincoln Sea is an additional dispute between Canada and Greenland / Kingdom of Denmark, which is over Hans Island. And that's different. It's different for a number of reasons. It's different because it's land, and it's different because of its profile. Both sides know where Hans Island is, roughly speaking. They know that it exists. It's the last piece of land to be disputed in the Arctic region. And it has gained a lot of political momentum as almost a symbolic thing at this stage. Now, I highly doubt that Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark are going to go to war over Hans Island. I mean, let's just say that's probably never going to happen. But it's an interesting case when we're looking about the impact that cultural ideas and societal impacts can have on the way that legal disputes are negotiated. And the fact that it has this profile impacts the capacity of both sides to resolve this dispute in comparison to the Lincoln Sea, which most people don't even know where it is on a map, let alone the fact that there's two little disputed areas there between the two states. So, the focus case study that I'll discuss with you today is over the Northwest Passage. Now, how did this dispute happen, and why does it matter? So, when we're talking about Canada and the Arctic, as I mentioned earlier and showed on the last slide, protecting Canadian Arctic sovereignty is a big deal. It is this notion that Canadian sovereignty is being attacked or taken for granted by an other, whether it's the United States, who has a bit of a history of being seen as the other, or potentially the Kingdom of Denmark in the case of Hans Island. But the implication of this protecting Arctic sovereignty discourse, which has no clear definition and is certainly not based on any real legal understanding of sovereignty, is that it creates a certain projection of homogeneity about Canada's position on what the Arctic is and their ownership claims. Now, why does that matter? It matters because they're dealing with an other. So essentially what happens is that it's not that suddenly those three predominant ideas and the conflict between them disappears. This tension between keeping the Arctic as this pristine area versus an area to develop just goes away. What happens is that there is a unification that just automatically seems to happen within Canadian discourse, that regardless if I think the Arctic should be protected and you think it should be developed, that is a disagreement between us within Canada. this other person or other place is trying to take away something from us, whether it be the status over the Northwest Passage or this large wedge-shaped area over in the Beaufort Sea. So for the sake of winning the argument that we have the right to decide, and then we can dispute amongst ourselves what that decision is, we push against it. And what often rises up and how it's articulated in Canadian media is this idea of protecting Arctic sovereignty, protecting the right to choose. And so what is this case study of the Northwest Passage, as I mentioned? So the existence of this Northwest Passage idea, well, that's been around for centuries. But Canada's problem in terms of it being seen as a disputed area really only emerged in the 1960s. Now, there was always a political awareness within Canada, even before then, that the legal status of the northern waters was never really clarified. And they knew this. They just kind of avoided getting caught up in making any firm claim for various political reasons, mostly not wanting to antagonize the United States, who, in contrast to Canada, has a very firm policy on the freedom of the seas. But what ended up happening is that in 1969, shortly after the Alaskan oil was discovered, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that the Northwest Passage could become an international shipping route emerged again in political discourse. And as a result, the issue which Canada had been skirting, which was making any firm claim on waters in the Arctic region, suddenly became something it couldn't really avoid. But by God, did it try. So what had happened was that the company which had the license, or the leases, to export the oil from Alaska was considering different options for moving the Alaskan oil down to mainland United States. And one of the options that it considered was to ship the oil through supertankers through the Northwest Passage. Now, this tension between these different ideas, the Arctic as a romanticized idea, the Arctic as a romanticized area, the Arctic as an economic area, and the Arctic as an area that needs to be protected, has been around for some time. But when the idea to ship oil through the Arctic, or the Canadian Arctic, first emerged, there was genuine interest on the part of the government to see whether or not this was economically viable and a means of profiting for the Canadian economy. And so what the government did is that it supported the company, which was Humble Oil, and their interest in doing test runs. And their ship was the SS Manhattan. Now, this situation has gotten quite a bit of attention in any sort of Arctic studies literature, because it's been quite important for a lot of different reasons. But what it is important about in the context of this book is that it's important for illustrating the role that different cultural conceptions of the Arctic have had on shifting the way that the government of Canada approached the Arctic region, and also for the long-term implications of it in terms of Canada's ability to negotiate with other parties about the legal status of the Northwest Passage. So what had happened is that the Canadian government was aware that there could be some pushback from the Canadian people about the status of the Northwest Passage. What it had done was that it helped provide Coast Guard services and aerial photography services to the company as it was doing its testing. It was in support. But when the Canadian media caught wind of this, everything exploded. Now, there's a particular reason for this, and it's the fact that it's often referred to as the SS Manhattan dispute is a bit of a distraction, because it wasn't the company or the SS Manhattan itself that really kicked off this dispute. The dispute was really kicked off by the fact that the United States refused to ask for permission to send vessels through the Canadian Arctic waters. For its own part, Canada never actually had the claims that it has now over the Arctic region. So it was possible, theoretically, for the Manhattan and any American Coast Guard vessel that would accompany it at any point in time in its journey to go through the Arctic archipelago waters without entering into Canadian waters. Because at the time, all that Canada had claimed was the standard 3 nautical miles of seas off of its lane. And so there was parts of the Arctic which it was possible to transit through without entering into any of those 3 nautical miles Canadian waters. The problem is ice. Who knew? It's the Arctic. And so what had happened is that as the vessel was going through, and it was being worked with the Canadian Coast Guard vessel, the John A. Macdonald, is that it tried to exit the Canadian Arctic. So it originally had entered in from the eastern Arctic and was going to go out the western Arctic. And the original planned route, it's hard for me to point out up there, but the original route was out through the McClure Strait. But it couldn't get out. The ice was too thick. So it had to redivert and go down through the Prince of Wales Strait, past what was called, or what is called, Banks Island, and go out the Amundsen Gulf. And because of its diverted traffic, it actually entered into Canadian waters. Now, again, this was just as a means of emphasizing the Canadian discourse that, we got to protect our waters, they're going to enter into our waters, what are we going to do? But the idea that the United States was never going to ask permission to use the waters is what really kicked off this whole debate. And so Canada, again, playing on these ideas of protection and environmental discourse, came up through essentially the ingenuity of someone who's called Ivan Head, who was a legal advisor to Pierre Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister at the time. He came up with this idea of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. And it's the gem that just keeps on giving. So what this is essentially a piece of legislation which gave Canada the right to interfere in shipping on the basis of environmental protection and to set up standards for what a ship would be required to have in terms of the skills of different members, the ship's construction and what have you, in order to get permission to go through the Canadian waters. So they're not telling a state that you can't use them, but you can only use them in certain conditions because we're protecting. And so what you ended up having was a big firestorm between the United States and Canada, and this went on for a few years, about whether or not it was proper for Canada to implement legislation that would give a state the right to interfere in freedom of the seas and the use of an international strait. Now, a long story short, it's a bit of a simplification here. Canada eventually pushed for what was included as the ice-covered regions or areas clause in the Third United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Article 234, which, while does not completely correspond with what was called the AWPPA, it essentially reaffirmed that in ice-covered areas, a state such as Canada or Soviet Union at the time, Russia today, has the right to interfere in shipping for the protection on the grounds of environmental protection. And this has been quite a landmark move for this whole idea about Canada pushing and Canada reaffirming its belief that the Northwest Passage is Canada's and it has a right to do exceptional things, that it even goes against international law at the time in order to back that up. But this idea that the Northwest Passage is Canada's stems back to its British history, whether it's the British history of portraying this Victorian era of romanticized exploration of the region, or the Victorian era beginning notions of the Arctic as an economic opportunity area for the bravest and the strongest to venture into and profit from. This idea of the Northwest Passage as Canada's and as something which Canada inherited from its British forefathers has really been very influential in terms of setting up this idea that there's really no negotiating room in Canadian society as to whether or not the Northwest Passage is Canada's. Now, to back that up, there's been a lot of work with First Nations peoples Indigenous peoples in order to get them from their own use of the Arctic region and the Northwest Passage in particular as an ice-covered area that has been lived on and used, to lend their support to the argument that Canada has the right to claim these waters as historic waters that have been used by millennium by the original Canadians. So there's been a lot of trade-offs and political use there of relations with Indigenous peoples. But there is a lot of baggage on this notion of the Northwest Passage. Whether it's a series of passageways or an imagined area, there is very little maneuverability for the government of Canada to turn around tomorrow and say, oh no, we had it wrong all these years, it's an international strait. I mean, that's going to break a government right there. Because this idea that the Northwest Passage is Canada's is so ingrained in Canadian society that there's really no maneuverability for the government. Now you contrast that to the Lincoln Sea. The Lincoln Sea has really no impact on the evolution of Canadian stories about the Arctic or the conceptions of the Arctic. It is an area that hasn't really been inhabited, still isn't. Alert is a bit of an exception, but Alert is a research station. It is a dispute that is relatively recent, came about in the 1970s, and is a dispute that's based purely on a legal disagreement on how to draw an equidistance boundary. It is not a dispute that evolves from any of this historical baggage. And so, both governments, the government of Canada and the government of the Kingdom of Denmark, came up with some sort of tentative agreement. Now, ironically enough, when I was doing the research for this book, I could find out that there was a tentative agreement in place. But when I was doing contact with people from both sides, I could never find out if the agreement was ever passed or what the details of the agreement were. But interestingly, the only piece of information that was ever really disclosed about the agreement was the explicit exclusion of Hans Island from it. And that goes back to the fact that Hans Island catches media attention in both Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark and plays into these romanticized notions about Arctic exploration and land claiming. And so neither side could agree on how to deal with that, and they still can't. So they continue to agree to disagree, and every so many years they send over a few military fellows to swap out bottles of alcohol. But the Lincoln Sea area, completely devoid from any real connotation to whether it's the domestic ideas about the Arctic within Canadian society or any of the subsequent discourse involving the international disputes in terms of protecting Arctic sovereignty. And so making an agreement on it doesn't really impact the visual of the map of Canada or the map of the Kingdom of Denmark. And it doesn't undermine any of the preconceived notions that Canadians have about the Arctic region. So there's some sort of tentative agreement out there in place about this. I'm not quite sure what the details are, because from the last time that I checked, I couldn't find any more specific information, except Hans Island is the only thing that they have been explicit that they will not touch. So overall, my point is, and what I really try to emphasize and argue in the book, is that while the legal dimensions of disputes is important to understand and discuss, it is also important to account for the social cultural relationship with the area, whether it be the Arctic or the North in general, or the specific areas under dispute. If you're going to try to understand a government's or the negotiators representing them, their capacity to come up with a successful agreement, which not only works on the international level with the other party they're negotiating with, but also to the domestic audiences they need to sell these agreements to. So it might be perfectly possible and perfectly logical for the government of Canada's negotiators to go and negotiate with some state, for example, the United States, over some agreement over the Northwest Passage. But to come home to a domestic political audience and to say anything short of the fact that they got absolutely everything that they had argued was theirs would not be palatable within domestic politics. So instead, a lot of the trade-offs and the agrees to disagrees involve tacit consent and things happening more quietly, rather than anything explicitly being put out there. And as a result, they don't really engage with any sort of negotiation over it. What will be interesting to see evolve as time goes on is the implications of climate change on the emergence of Arctic water routes and on the emergence of other state actors, because traditionally Canada's disagreement over the Northwest Passage has heavily involved the United States. But now you have actors like China, as they've come out and explicitly stated in their white paper earlier this year that they see the Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea route over in the Russian Arctic, and the route over the North Pole as international areas that they can use. So it'll be interesting to see that as climate change happens and as the Arctic region opens up, whether or not the inclusion of other actors, such as China, will have much of an influence on how the government of Canada starts to approach its Arctic region, whether it to be just the governance of it or the entering into negotiations in order to shore up, to some degree, some formalized understanding about other peoples and other states' agreements on Canada's rights over these areas. And last, but certainly not least, there's plenty of people to thank. So when I did most of this research, I was based at Aberystwyth University, where I did my PhD, but also at the University of Southern Denmark doing my postdoc. My PhD studies was funded by a Rothmer Fellowship, and my postdoc that I was working on while I was completing most of this book was funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. So I'm very grateful and thankful to both foundations for their funding of my research and for their assistance in the completion of this book. Now, also presently, I am on a Marie Curie Individual Fellowship, which is an ERC research grant. And so they have gratefully or graciously supported my research that I'm doing now, which in part contributes to my capacity to come here to you today and to talk to you about my research on the Arctic region, to which this is part of the broader picture of my research portfolio. So I'm very grateful to them as well as the Carlsberg Foundation, who have actually funded my arrival here today and my ability to come here and talk to you more specifically. I also have to thank my publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, for actually publishing the book. And if you would like to find out more information about this book, which is available both in hard copy as well as ebook form, you can go onto their website or Google the title of the book, International Disputes and Cultural Ideas in the Canadian Arctic. And if you go on to the University of Greenland's website where where the information for this talk was available, there's also a flyer available which gives you more information about the publisher and the book, as well as a promotional code. And last but certainly not least, thank you, Maria, for hosting me here today and for making all the necessary arrangements for me to come here and talk to you today and to be part of the University of Greenland's public lecture series. So thank you very much, and thank you all of you for having me here today.